And then last week we talked about debt. And what does debt like, and how does it affect us, and where is God, and all of that. So this week I'd like to talk a little bit about saving as another piece of the puzzle when it comes to finances. And actually perhaps completely go in a different direction from my sermon 2 weeks ago. But that's okay. That's how it goes. God's still speaking, right? So when I was in 6th grade, I got an allowance of $4 a week, right? Big money. And I remember reading in Dear Abby that some people's parents made them save 10 cents for every dollar that they got in their allowance. But my parents never made me do that. But I do remember that I was interested in saving up. And the thing that I wanted was a Nintendo game system. So I'm dating myself a little bit here, I realize that. But that was what I wanted. But they were $100. Yeah, I know. And if you only get $4 a week, that's 25 weeks of saving your entire allowance. And so I never ended up getting one. I think I did end up saving for a radio, a cool one. With a digital display and double cassette tapes so you could make mixtapes, right? Yeah? All right. Mixtapes! Okay, I know it's a thing of the past. It's past. No one ever makes mixtapes anymore. But anyway, so that was kind of an early experience that I had with saving. But the thing is with saving, I think one of the reasons I probably didn't get the Nintendo game set is my parents didn't want me to have one. But one of the other reasons is that saving in some ways goes against our natural inclinations. I've been reading this book called Long Fuse, Big Bang, and the guy is talking about how our brains are organized to keep us surviving on the savanna grasslands and the tundra, in the midst of wild animals and famines and, lots of mortal dangers that we just don't face anymore these days for the most part, right? So our brains are evolved to be very here and now, right? So if I should have done this, but I didn't do it, but I went and got a donut and set it right in front of you. Let's imagine that there's a donut here, right? And I set it in front of you, and then I started talking about annuities. Which thing would you be paying more attention to? The donut or what the heck an annuity is? Because no one knows what an annuity is, right? So, does anyone know what an annuity is? Sort of. Okay, right, yeah. I think that's as good as anybody gets, right? Sort of. How did I get distracted by annuities? So my point is that our brains are very here and now, and what they want to do is get as much possible now and then not worry too much about the future. So if I said to somebody, I'll give you $10 now or $15 in a week, most people will take the $10 now because your animal brain is thinking, you know what, it's possible I could get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger next week, and so I'll just take the $10 now. Right? So saving can be a little bit counterintuitive. And in fact, if I get to thinking too much about a budget, I'll suddenly have these weird compulsions to shop. Right? Does anyone else? All right. I don't know. No, if normally I'm not a big shopper. I'm okay with it, but if I start working on a budget too much, I'll start remembering all the stuff I have to buy. And I think it's the animal brain being there's going to be a famine. We need to stock up. Okay? So our brains are working against us a little bit when it comes to trying to save. Now, I will admit that Jesus is not really a saver. He doesn't provide us a good example. I know I'm wearing the shirt, right? Jesus Saves, right? And the title of the sermon is Jesus Saves. But really, Jesus was someone who wandered around teaching and relying on other people's hospitality. And so if you have the WWJD bracelet and you're trying to decide if Jesus would contribute to his 401k, the answer is probably not. All right. But there were people who were supporting him in his ministry who I'm pretty confident were big savers. So Mary Magdalene is one particular example. She's someone that Jesus had healed, and then she became one of his followers. And she would go around with him and just make sure that he and his disciples were well provided for. And she couldn't have done that if she hadn't been able to save up and to have some funds available to do that. And so she was able to, because she was a saver, support Jesus' ministry, right? And then later, after Jesus dies, she, in all 4 Gospels, she's the only woman who shows up at each of the resurrection stories. So Mary Magdalene, because she was a saver, because she was like this woman that we read about in Proverbs, becomes someone who's able to support and to witness to amazing ministry because she's able to save. So we talked a little bit last week about debt and how it's kind of like getting into a swimming pool with no ladders, right? It's like sinking. The opposite then, I see saving in some ways as being the opposite of debt. Because on the one hand, saving's the opposite in that you have to wait for the thing and then get it after you've earned it, right? But then it's also the opposite in the sense that in some ways it's like instead of sinking into a pool, it's like you're building a pedestal. So the experts recommend having, for example, 6 to 12 months worth of expenses on hand, easily available in your savings account in case some kind of big emergency comes up. And that is a little bit like having a pedestal or having your house up on stilts in case the flood comes, right? But what makes it possible to do those things? What makes it so that we can turn down the animal brain, right, and be able to live a little bit more out of logic and out of planning ahead, like this woman that we read about in Proverbs? And I think the key is to have some big, vivid goals, or to have something at the center of our lives beyond that one more latte, right? Or whatever our budget buster is. I know all of us have different ones. Eating lunch out or gambling addiction, whatever. Stuff like that. Chocolate, thank you. Chocolate is a budget buster for some of us. Really good chocolate, right? Yes. John? Toys can definitely be a budget buster for grown-ups and children alike, right? Oh, yeah, a lot of kids do. A lot of kids love toys. Yeah, see, it can happen. And so you might say, I'd really like that big toy. But then you say, it takes a while to save for it. I'll just get this little one that's not as good, right? That can happen. And we can be discouraged from saving. But if we have a big, vivid goal that we can keep in front of us, if that goal of supporting ministry, of being part of God's kingdom, of putting God at the center of our lives, can become the thing that is more important than the smaller luxuries that we might be interested in, that puts us on the path, right? To be able to say, I like this small thing, but I really want this big thing, right? So I have two stories about this, right? The first one we'll talk about our reading from Proverbs, right? I realize on a certain sense that this is not a super feminist text, right? It's like, her husband is so proud of her, right? But on the other hand, this is a reminder to me about, it kind of reminds me of like, did anyone read Little House on the Prairie when you were growing up? Right? And they had to make their own butter and beat their rugs with sticks and make their own clothes and everything. And so at one time, it was a lot of physical labor, and it took a lot of intelligence and, personal energy to keep a household going as a woman, right? So the role of being a housewife has changed somewhat, I guess I'll say, in the intervening 3,000 years since Proverbs was written. And so you can see in the story we read from Proverbs, so this woman, she's making her own clothes, she's keeping her family well fed, she's demonstrating generosity, and in doing all of that, she earns honor for herself and for her family, right? And so that, in a sense, is a vision of what the payoff is for saving and for planning ahead, is that you can live a life that is giving to others and is generous and is honorable. And then one more story I want to tell you is about a woman. Her name was Osceola McCartney, and she was a philanthropist. And she gave about $150,000 to the University of Southern Mississippi. And she's African American, and the scholarship was so African American kids could go to school there. Now, that's not unusual, right? People give money to universities for scholarships. What is unusual, though, is that this woman washed clothes for a living. She quit school when she was in 6th grade, and did the hard work of getting her hands into the water every day. She ironed clothes by hand, and she did it for more than 70 years. She didn't retire until she was 87 years old. She never had a color TV. She lived very simply, and by doing all those things, she was able to save up a lot of money to make someone else's education possible. And so there is an image to me that says, if she can do it, then all of us on some level can do it. And we just have to find what that vision is, what that place is that allows us to dream big and to work for it, and to put in the time and put in the effort to do it. So my hope is that we will find in Jesus and in His kingdom, in the kingdom of God that He tells us about, the dream, the big vision that can pull us forward and help us to live in an honorable and foresightful way. I realize that Jesus was not necessarily, like I say, an example of saving, but I will say He did live within His means, right? If He needed some bread, He would kind of borrow some and break it and hand it out to everybody, and suddenly there were 5,000 loaves, right? Or if He needed some money to pay a tax, He'd send somebody out to go fishing, and they'd catch a fish, and there'd be a coin in the mouth of the fish. So in a sense, He never, He always had enough as much as He needed, and He wasn't complaining because He and His disciples didn't get to stay at the Hilton, right? So my hope is that we will find in Jesus' love and find in His ministry the inspiration to be savers for a bigger cause. And that all of this will help us to live big lives for God. My hope is that we will find the grace to live with this discipline, to live with generosity, and trust always that in the end, it is Jesus who saves. Thanks be to God. Amen.